Thank you, Chair. And I just want to thank the witnesses today for their careers of work in this area. This is a really important area right now, and we need help. Mr. Bugajski, you've written about these frozen conflicts in Eastern Europe. We've seen Russia ignore territorial sovereignty, occupy land in Moldova, Eastern Ukraine, Crimea, Georgia. It's been 9 years since Russia troops invaded Georgia. And they've created a frozen conflict. I never heard of that before coming to the Senate, but this is outrageous. I'd like all of you to comment on this question. We've seen Russia from Murmansk to Kaliningrad right now is bristling. It's a bristling military enclave. We've seen them in Sebastopol have access to warm waters. And now in Latakia and Tartus in Syria, build permanent installations circling Eastern Europe. I mean, it looks to me like from a tactical standpoint, it's pretty obvious what they're doing. My questions, though, are very specific about these frozen conflicts. What is NATO doing? What are we doing? What should we be doing to make sure that the Georgia conflict does not remain frozen and that the Ukraine-Crimea conflict does not become a frozen conflict?
Excellent question. Thank you, Senator. I would say this. We need to understand what Russia's up to with these so-called frozen conflicts or unresolved conflicts. The idea is to freeze the state within which the conflict is taking place. We see this clearly in the case of Ukraine and Georgia, to prevent these countries from moving into NATO. In the Moldovan case, to prevent Moldova from moving into the European Union. In the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, keeping both Azerbaijan and Armenia dependent on Russia to try and resolve the conflict. We can be more active in some, particularly I would say in Georgia and between Armenia and Azerbaijan. In the case of Ukraine, I would say it's very important for the Ukrainian government to be able to prevent Russia from expanding its territorial hold on Ukraine and using the frozen conflict as a tool of pressure to prevent Ukraine from moving into Western institutions.
Should the U.S. arm the Ukraine with offensive weapons?
Absolutely. I would give them any weapons they want. I mean, in a way you could say Ukraine is a test for our resolve in stopping Putin. If Putin is successful in Ukraine, can you imagine the ambition that will be raised? If he's stopped in Ukraine, that will not only stop him from meddling in other countries, but could have a blowback inside Russia as well.
Yes, Sam?
I would just add that I think Putin has already been successful in Ukraine. I don't think his intention was ever to take Kiev. I think it was to destabilize just enough to make Ukraine an unattractive partner for NATO and for the West. I think, how do we support these governments? I support arming them, not quite to giving them any weapon they would want, but they do need lethal assistance. A bigger challenge, though, is making sure the part of the country that has not fallen under Russian control continues to integrate with the West, continues on its path of anti-corruption and transparency measures to be the best model of governance it can be, so that the part of the country that is inside of a frozen conflict sort of falls under the weight of its own corruption and problems and challenges, and now you have sort of the other half, 3/4 of a country that is successful and that creates its own magnetism and draw. And then finally, the most probably important piece of the equation is patience. None of these frozen conflicts are going to be resolved in the near future. But having a clear non-recognition policy, which is tied up in our sanctions, I think is important. We had a non-recognition policy with the Baltic states for 50 years, and that was very important to their prospects for one day integrating with the West.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Senator. I would just add that the frozen conflicts are a means for the Russians to take out a long-term insurance policy that these countries will never be able to join NATO or the EU because they've been occupied. This is their objective. They don't need to depend on the word or commitment of one political leader that may come or go with an election. It's their insurance policy. The status quo and these endless negotiations, 5+2 for Transnistria, Geneva process in Georgia, Minsk with Ukraine, suit the Russian interests and get us trapped in a kabuki game. And many of our allies are quite pleased to have a process at least ongoing, but I actually don't think they serve our interests. I think we need to change the equation. In part, we told the Russians, or the Russians read our own doctrines that say, if there is occupied territory on a country, it cannot join our alliance. That's in the NATO study in 1996 as we were beginning our enlargement process to incentivize nations of Central Europe to resolve their borders. It made sense at that time. I think we should be a little bit more brazen and change that and say Russian occupation will not stand as a permanent block on nations joining the EU and NATO, even if that means the jurisdiction of the EU or NATO may not apply to those territories. Simply the rhetorical switch of that is how you begin to change Russia's calculations. And I do agree with my colleagues on, I think it is important that we give them the strength of a porcupine defense and help arm them in a way that it makes it cost too high for the Russians to invade.
Thank you all.